The U.S. debt and deficit crisis is a constant in the background of politics and economics, but it is rarely addressed in an honest and comprehensive manner. With this short video, I'd like to take a shot at addressing it. Firstly, what exactly is the debt and deficit crisis? Put simply, it is the untenable growth in the U.S. debt and the yearly deficit that has become the standard since the beginning of the millennium. Of note is that with current spending, the trust funds that back Medicare and Social Security will run dry shortly after the end of the decade, which would add $650 billion to the following year's deficit, and the fact that the longer the debt is left to fester and the more we borrow in the short term, the harder this crisis will be to solve. This crisis is complicated and multifaceted, but its causes boil down to a few main points. Firstly, the U.S. is simply getting old, and there aren't enough workers paying into the system relative to those withdrawing from it. Secondly, the U.S. is flat out unhealthy. The majority of the population is, by strict medical tenets, overweight or obese, which hurts American health and American wallets due to the cascading health effects and costs stemming from weight-related health problems. Both of these issues stress the system immensely and fuel the deficit like crazy. Finally, investments into the U.S. by the federal government have been on a steady decline for the past 5 odd decades. As for what that means for the U.S., I'll touch on that in the next section. The big question overhanging all of this is how exactly we can solve this crisis, assuming we can at all. This crisis is still solvable. There are many developed countries that have come back from far worse, but we have to be smart with our actions. First and foremost, we must get the deficit down. Decreasing expenditures has proven impossible regardless of the flavor of Congress and what administration has control of the White House. Besides, the deficit is greater in size than all non-defense discretionary spending, so solely cutting spending is physically incapable of solving this issue. In order to actually solve it, we have to increase government revenues. To do this, we can either raise taxes or we can raise GDP. Tax increases massively slow down the economy, and all current proposed tax-related solutions would barely even scratch the deficit. That leaves only increasing GDP on the table. Luckily, increasing GDP as a solution is actually quite promising. A recent report by the IMF found that investment spending, even when financed by borrowing, grows the economy and reduces the debt-to-GDP ratio. However, investments have to be well-targeted and well-timed, or they risk being inconsequential or even counterproductive. There is another benefit to investment spending as well. As I mentioned earlier, the ratio of workers to retirees continues to decrease. Increasing workers' productivity is one of the best ways to solve that particular issue, and investment spending would both increase worker productivity and reduce the debt-to-GDP ratio at the same time. Despite the fact this crisis is entering its later stages, with prompt, well-targeted investments, this crisis is entirely manageable. We as individuals and communities have to push our representatives in Congress to finally address this issue in an honest manner. As for myself, I still maintain a high degree of hope. Thank you for listening, and hopefully you've taken something away from this.